This is the first communist in Fort Jameson, Chapter 2, which is on Northern Rhodesia and Zambia, which became Zambia. Section 1, London, 1960. My personal discovery of Africa began in 1960. As a child, I remember being quite proud of the British Empire. My stamp collection consisted only of stamps from countries marked red on the map. However, as a student in the 1950s, I learnt something about the iniquities of colonialism. At school, I remember a talk by Reginald Reynolds, a Quaker who had travelled from Cairo to the Cape. He vividly described the segregation he found all over southern Africa. And I got interested in the idea of volunteering in Cape Flats, it is a township outside Cape Town. The Observer newspaper covered Africa brilliantly in those days, and some of us joined the movement for colonial freedom. This was led by the redoubtable Labour MP Fenner Brockway. Then in May 1957, I remember seeing a group of Ghanaian students jumping up and down in Trinity Street, Cambridge, shouting "Freedom" on the day Ghana became independent. We read about the impressive leaders of the struggle, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria, Julius Nyerere in what was then Tanganyika. Yet, elsewhere, oppression continued. Jomo Kenyatta was still in detention in Kenya, where the war against the Mau Mau rebels showed its worst brutality when 11 of the hardcore were clubbed to death and 77 injured at Hola Camp in 1959. And, as I was later to witness, the white settlers of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland were still trying to resist the inevitable. This federation had been set up in 1953 as a British attempt to create a new dominion linking Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia, which were both protectorates, where native interests were to some extent protected, with southern Rhodesia, where the white settlers were more numerous and the Africans were marginalised. The settlers who effectively ruled the Federation were Rhodesians, mostly of British origin, many of them recent arrivals, but their attitudes were not much different from those of the Afrikaners who dominated South Africa, where the policies of apartheid and separate development had been imposed from 1948 onwards. While I was in India, I tried to follow the African news, especially the rise of Lumumba and the independence of the Congo, and many French-speaking countries. I also met up with some Kenyan students in Delhi who talked of their independence struggle, and they complained about racism in India. In those days, you could apply to teach in the colonies. The colonial office, housed in a rambling Victorian edifice, since demolished, in Great Smith Street near Westminster Abbey, paid for postgraduate training with fairly generous pocket money at the Institute of Education in London. The deal required that you serve in Her Majesty's colonial service for 3 years. I thought it would be interesting to learn Arabic, so I opted to go to Aden, but happily I was selected instead to go to Northern Rhodesia. The Education in Tropical Areas course was fairly boring. The tropical bit included a section on health, where we had to study things like the Anopheles mosquito and the hookworm, an annoying creature which apparently entered your feet and then travelled systematically to all corners of your body. One bit of orientation for the colonies which I missed, but Edith, my future wife, was to experience, was the introduction to the Women's Corona Society. Kate McRae recalls some of the typical advice handed out to women heading for the colonies. Quote, "Matching linen table mat napkins should be folded into water lilies, which is something quite easily taught to an African. And when exporting a grand piano, make sure it is fully tropicalised." I did, however, buy an ant-proof trunk from an old-fashioned firm which supplied everything a colonialist could possibly want, from pith helmets to mosquito boots to hurricane lamps and paraffin cookers. African politics were more enthralling than the hookworm. The Belgian Congo became theoretically independent on the 30th of June 1960. Its leader, Patrice Lumumba, wanted real independence, and he was captured and killed 6 months later. The Belgians and Americans were both implicated. An angry crowd of us, including the African students on my course, joined a big march and shouted slogans outside the Belgian embassy. There were not many black people in London in those days. West Indians, as they were called then, the Windrush generation, were working on the buses and the tube. Calypso and ska, but not yet reggae, could already be heard on the streets of Notting Hill and Brixton. Africans from Africa were a rarer sight. They were usually well dressed, and most were students on British Council scholarships or sent by rich parents. Ghana and Nigeria were already independent. Sanko, a fellow student, took me to a Sierra Leonean dance, where I first met Ai Kabia, who was on a nursing course. We spent a lot of time together until I left for Africa in August 1961. Through Ai and her friends, I got to learn a bit about the frustrations of African and Caribbean people in London, faced with blatant racism when trying to find a room or a job. Yet there was an atmosphere of hope and determination among the African students. The liveliest African place at that time was WASU, the West African Students' Union, which had been founded as early as 1925. The Ghanaians had also set up a centre in Collingham Gardens in Earl's Court. The Ghana government, led by Kwame Nkrumah, was planning to develop this as a beacon of Pan-Africanist ideas. Shortly afterwards, some British Roman Catholic Friends of Africa had decided to counter this by establishing the Africa Centre in Covent Garden, where I much later served as director. Northern Rhodesians were even rarer than other Africans. The first one I met, Joe Mwemba, was one of the country's first graduates. He was on a sponsored visit, and the British Council wanted someone to show him around London. I later met him in Zambia when he'd become an inspector of schools. 5 of us on the course at the Institute of Education were going to Northern Rhodesia. Joy Orr had managed to penetrate the London group of Kenneth Kawanda's UNIP party, and I went with her and met the future Vice President Simon Kapwepwe, the future Attorney General Fitzpatrick Chula, and my unforgettable future colleague, Carpenter Kafamukache, in a dingy basement in Upper Gower Street. Apart from Carpenter, they seemed a bit suspicious of these noisy white people, as well they might have been given the attitude of the colonial regime towards UNIP at the time. Another memory I have is of a group of African girls singing at a party at Wasu. The soloist was Gwen Coney, who will feature later in my story. She became Zambia's first woman ambassador and even stood for the presidency in 2006. Most of the Africans on my course stayed at the British Council hostel in Hans Crescent, just behind Harrods. And to their credit, the colonial office people had urged us to stay there too. I rather regretted I did not take their advice, as there was a lively African atmosphere there, with a brilliant group of Ugandan students, among whom I made friends, in particular with Joseph Mwanga, who was later involved with the groundbreaking journal Transition. However, I had a good time sharing a flat in Primrose Hill with Kay Whiteman, later to be the editor of West Africa magazine. We also saw a lot of Keith Henry, a Trinidadian friend whom I had met at Cambridge, and we went to more plays and films than any other time in my life. A highlight for us that year was the production of the South African musical King Kong, with Petty Pango in the lead. This was a show which defied apartheid. The music was by Todd Matshikiza, whom we later met in Lusaka when he was in exile, and whose daughter Marion was to be my colleague in Christian Aid in 1998. And we produced King Kong at Kalomo Secondary School in Zambia in 1969. Section 2, The Voyage Out. Northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, landlocked and shaped like a rather lopsided butterfly, is a huge territory which ended up British in the scramble for Africa, although the Portuguese had made an unrealistic claim for all the land between Mozambique and Angola, which included this area. Cecil Rhodes, who founded the De Beers Diamond Mining Company and became Prime Minister of Cape Colony, was ambitious to extend British control. He made, often fraudulent, treaties with African rulers for mineral concessions, and this was followed by white settlement. The Litunga, that's the king, of Barotse land in the west of Northern Rhodesia, agreed to such a treaty in 1890, and in the same year Rhodes established the British South Africa Company. The first white pioneers arrived in Fort Salisbury, which is now Harare, Zimbabwe. Rhodes wanted empire, but he did not want control from London. He established a kind of a colonial franchise whereby the British South Africa Company ruled the 3 territories named after himself: Southern, Northwestern and Northeastern Rhodesia. The latter 2 merged in 1911 as Northern Rhodesia, with its capital next to the Victoria Falls at Livingstone. From 1904, the railway was extended over the amazing bridge over the Zambezi to serve the mines at Broken Hill and those in Katanga, which was part of the Belgian Congo. Southern Rhodesia became self-governing by the white minority in 1923. Northern Rhodesia remained a British protectorate ruled from London. However, it had a small but influential population of white farmers and businessmen whose political ambitions, along with the desire of the Southern Rhodesian whites to enjoy the wealth of the copper mines in Northern Rhodesia, were the reason for the creation of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland in 1953. Nyasaland, which is now Malawi, had even fewer settlers. It seemed logical to include it for geographical reasons. Africans in Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland rightly saw federation as a plot to give land rights and control to white settlers and as an abdication of Britain's protection. They opposed it bitterly, and their voice was ignored. By the time I set off for Africa, this bitterness had boosted nationalism. The original Northern Rhodesia African National Congress, led by Harry Nkumbula, had been outflanked by the even more nationalistic United National Independence Party, UNIP, led by Kenneth Kaunda. There were a number of violent incidents known as the Cha-Cha-Cha. Federation had promised partnership, in inverted commas. Lord Malvern, the Federation's founding Prime Minister, had described this as the partnership of a rider and a horse. The Africans were determined not to be the horse any longer, and the British government belatedly began to understand that its duty to the populations of Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland was incompatible with the continuance of the Federation. One of independent Zambia's first actions in 1964 was remove the statue of physical energy, in fact, a rider on a horse, which had graced the roundabout in front of Lusaka's High Court, to drive it through the streets and send it to the Department of Antiquities in Salisbury, Southern Rhodesia, which is now, of course, Harare in Zimbabwe. In August 1961, I waved goodbye to IE and to my mother as the boat train steamed out, yes, steam it was, out of Waterloo Station, and I entered a strange intermediate world, mainly populated by white South Africans sailing home on RMS Pretoria Castle to Cape Town. Bilious Afrikaners and pipe-chewing planters was how I described them in a letter home. They seemed to grow whiter as we moved south, and when they saw you were coming to Africa for the first time, they rushed to defend their colour bar. A pity you're going to the wogs. There was the traditional crossing the line ceremony when he crossed the equator, and everyone joined in the chorus of the favourite Afrikaans song, Sari Mare, O bring me terug na die ou Transvaal, daar waar my Sari woon. 3 of my fellow recruits to teach in Northern Rhodesia were also on board, and these 10 days of reading, eating, were a very good way of preparing for life in a new world. Conversations overheard on the ship were a preparation for apartheid, but Cape Town Station brought it home. You went through a Slechts Blancas whites-only entrance and past the white parcels office, and your bags were carried by a white porter. But once you were through the entrance, the platform was not segregated. Our train climbed up into the mountains, blue and pink in the evening light, the few trees throwing heavy shadows. We woke the next morning on the Karoo, a huge flat plain covered with scrawny grass, passing occasional untidy settlements beside the passing loops on the railway, with a water tower for steam trains, several general stores, a few cottages for white workers and segregated huts for blacks. The craziest bit of segregation was at Kimberley Station, where the footbridge had a barrier down the middle, but once you were in the street you were free to mix again. Most of the passengers on the train were white, but the front coach, where most of the soot from the locomotive landed, was reserved for blacks. This was winter and the nights in the train were cold. The train stopped at Mafeking, which was famous for being besieged in 1899 to 1900 during what the British called the Boer War. This town was still the capital of Bechuanaland Protectorate in 1961, although it was just inside South Africa. The capital moved to the small town of Gaborone just before the independence of the new state of Botswana in 1965. Seen from the railway, Bechuanaland was still a wide open plain, but broken up by funny little hills and covered by bush resembling an immense wild apple orchard. The country had just been suffering from exceptional drought, rather than its usual dry semi-desert climate, and the development of the country had been totally neglected by the British, who controlled it along with Lesotho and Swaziland from their High Commission in Pretoria. The result was very evident poverty. Poorly dressed women were selling handicrafts at the little wayside stations. Visiting booming Botswana today makes it hard to imagine what it was like before independence. As we entered southern Rhodesia, the vegetation changed to the twisted leafy trees typical of the African plateau, and then to the freight yards and the busy junction at Bulawayo. Here we had time for a much-needed shower at the station, still whites only, and a short walk into town with its wide streets and buildings which would not be out of place in a Wild West film. After a third night, we crossed the iconic iron bridge over the Zambezi Gorge with the spray of the Victoria Falls in the distance, and into northern Rhodesia. The sun shone on the tall grass and the patchy savanna forest. We passed Kaloma, where I was later to spend 5 years, continued along the plateau, crossed the wide Kafue River and climbed up to Lusaka. The capital of Northern Rhodesia had moved from Livingstone to Lusaka in 1935. Chief Lusaka's village had been chosen as a site for the capital because it was in the centre of the country and it was on the level so the trains could stop and start easily. It had and has few interesting features, and in tune with the colonial mindset, residential and trading areas were segregated and separated. There was a main shopping centre, Cairo Road, a short stretch of Cecil Rhodes's dream of a British road and railway from Cape Town to Cairo, and a second-class shopping area where the shops were run by Indians and the customers were mostly Africans. A zone for government offices, cheap single-storey constructions with green roofs, some white suburbs with spacious bungalows and manicured lawns, and some townships for the blacks with rows of small identical houses. The only buildings of note were the State Secretariat, built in brown stone, and the red brick High Court, in front of which stood the rider and the horse, the fine statue erected in honour of Cecil Rhodes. I was welcomed at Lusaka station by a beery white civil servant and taken to the Longacres Hostel, a typical colonial building, also with a green roof, set in an undemonstrative garden. The evening was cold, and it was good to find a log fire ablaze on my first night on the ground in Africa. I spent a couple of days in Lusaka. A moustached official at the Ministry of African Education, there was a federal ministry for whites, coloureds and Asians, advised me that colonial civil servants needed to find something to do in their spare time, such as playing bridge or tennis, or for the really eccentric, indulging in anthropology. Probably guessed I was one of the latter. He also reminded me that the uniform was a white shirt and shorts with long white socks. I was taken on a visit to Manali Secondary School, the leading government school, indeed the only one with the sixth form, and also to Chalimbana Teacher Training College. I was then put on a plane to Fort Jameson and to my posting at Chisongwe's secondary school. Section 3, Fort Jameson. The usual way to get to Fort Jameson was along the Great East Road. It was nearly 400 miles from Lusaka. In 1961, the first 140 miles was a wide dirt road with extensive views over the bush landscape, past the Chinyunyu hot springs, which were surrounded by a type of palm tree, the fruit of which reputedly made elephants drunk. There were a few bloated baobab trees as well. At Manenekela, the road climbed dramatically along the edge of a deep valley where, before the road was widened, many vehicles had fallen into the gorge below. Halfway to Fort Jameson was the neat government hotel at Kachalola, with roses and poinsettia in the garden and even a swimming pool. The view over the thick green woodlands to the grey hills across the border to Mozambique is still stunning today, though the hotel is closed and dilapidated. A little further on was the long metal-framed bridge over the Luangwa River, a major tributary of the Zambezi. Then there was a sign saying, "Diversion, danger, bends for the next 73 miles. It wasn't a diversion, but this narrow winding stretch was only open for half a day in each direction. Then there was a final 130 miles of wide dirt road to the little town of Fort Jameson, the capital of the Eastern Province, surrounded by wooded hills with no fort to be seen. Its name was changed to Chipata at independence in 1964. I had looked it up in the handbook to the Federation before I left England, and it claimed there was a population of 400. This referred to Europeans. The thousands of Africans didn't get a mention. It also told me that the nearest railway station was 150 miles away in Nyasaland, now Malawi, a great disappointment for a railway enthusiast like me. Like most towns in southern Africa, Fort Jimmy had developed on the basis of segregated housing and schools for whites, coloureds, nations, and then for blacks. The town centre was a crossroads of two tarmac streets, boasting a modern Barclays Bank and a post office. Nearby was a red brick replica of an English Anglican village church. Camco, a European, quote, general store, and several shops run by Indians. Some distance from the centre, there was a so-called second-class trading area, a busy street of shops run by Indians with a mosque at one end. Fort Jameson's Indians were, unusually for this country, Muslims. There was an open-air market where vendors would squat on the ground and sell the plentiful local vegetables and fruit which were arranged in little heaps, priced tiki or susu, meaning threepence or sixpence, as well as twists of tobacco and various herbal remedies. The town boasted 4 clubs, the grandest being the Victoria Memorial Institute, where there was a plaque on the wall declaring that this was to be a memorial to the great Queen for all time. Apart from the barman, waiter and cleaners, no Africans were to be seen in the place. until we teachers started inviting our friends to sneak in and watch the amateur dramatics. Then there was the Moth, M-O-T-H, club, and a police club where fireworks would be let off on November the 5th, a ritual that the local people found very strange. A few African police officers were later to be allowed to join this club. Then there was also a very small multiracial club. In the 1950s, there had been a prosperous community of white tobacco farmers in this area. One ruined farm, where the land was returning to bush, had a dried-up swimming pool and the remains of a private aeroplane rusting in the yard. But by the 1960s, the main agricultural export was high-quality peanuts, grown by African peasant farmers and exported to Canada. Looking through letters that I wrote home at this time, it's possible to piece together the atmosphere of these strange times, the tail end of colonialism. The provincial administration was a small hierarchy which ruled the African population of Northern Rhodesia. When I was there, its head in the Eastern Province was D.C. Goodfellow, the provincial commissioner. The quote from a book on him describes him with his fierce moustache, his one arm. He'd lost the other as a young officer in India. He looked like some battle-scarred colonel. This quote was from African Sunset, a book by Robin Short, who praises the PC as a man of old-fashioned views, fair but firm, but sometimes fierce, but well liked by the other older villagers. The flavour of the PC comes across in a well-known remark of his. The nig pigs are all right if you give them something to pull on. Robin Short was a district commissioner on the next level of the hierarchy. He invited me for lunch a couple of times. In his paternalistic way, he loved his Africans and the docile visitors who saluted him, and he loathed and feared the change represented by the newly educated ones, who led the freedom movement and were cheeky enough to read the African Mail, a weekly paper which supported African aspirations but could hardly be called subversive. Short was fairly typical of the colonial rulers, some very public school, some mildly eccentric, quite a number Scottish. They had a lot of power. One district commissioner in Lundausia, 100 miles north of Fort Jameson, found he had a big stock of bricks, so he designed and had built a replica Norman castle as a government rest house. You can still stay there. Officers in more technical roles, such as agriculture and education, tended to be more in sympathy with the changes that were starting to take place. Although in fact a teacher, I was a colonial civil servant too. Africans filled the junior administrative levels, though a few were starting to be promoted to officer level. Although part of the partially self-governing Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, Northern Rhodesia was still a British protectorate, and the provincial administration looked after most of African affairs, while the federal government was responsible for many common matters and all those affecting the non-African population, including education. And we were to experience the last gasp of this type of education in Mufulira in 1965. The churches and the missionaries were part of this colonial picture. One Sunday I went on a visit to Msoro, an Anglican mission station about 80 miles away along a very bumpy road. An odd group of white men were sitting in a summer house eating cutlets when we arrived. Father Mudford, a sinewy man in his 60s, much loved by the locals, and in whose honour a library in Chipata is named. Then there was a healthy-looking missionary and a rather intense young Franciscan monk. After an interminably long service in the huge barn of a church, with incense, a church choir and the lot, we called on 3 aging spinsters, housed at a safe distance from these decidedly undangerous men, and were invited to sherry and a very English Sunday lunch. A year later, I attended an African wedding in Fort Rosebery, which is now called Mansa, in a mission belonging to the Plymouth Brethren, where the ambience was even more old-fashioned than at Msoro. There were withered texts in Gothic script on the walls, an aged washstand, and a 4-poster bed. Eccentricity took many forms. One of my best memories was visiting Mrs. Jereminski on her farm near Katete. Like most farms, its name was painted on an old plough blade at the gate, and you went up a long drive, 2 ruts with grass in the middle. The farmhouse was one of the oldest in the country, dating from 1903. We found Mrs. J sitting on the ground outside the tobacco curing barns, busily sorting groundnuts. A short woman with very white legs under a large straw sun hat. She was a fascinating survival from pioneering days. Born in Silesia, Germany, in around 1884, she worked as a child in Berlin. The man she was eventually to marry had come to northeastern Rhodesia, as it then was, and established the farm. He had then advertised in the German press for a wife. When he received a photo, he sent for the lady in the picture. He went to meet her, making the long journey by bicycle and boat down to the port of Beira in Portuguese Mozambique, and looked in vain for the girl in the photo. Then a woman came up to him and explained that her sister had had cold feet and that she'd come instead. Judging by the rather faded sepia photo she showed us, taken in Berlin in 1913, she was a good substitute. We learnt about this story later, but she did describe to us her honeymoon journey. This consisted of going by boat from Beira up the Shire River into Nyasaland, and then being carried in a machila, a kind of hammock attached to two poles, for the 350 miles to Katete. They covered about 20 miles a day, with a changing supply of natives to carry it, while her husband cycled along in front. She lived on the farm for the next 50 or so years. She went once to Germany in 1920 and hated it. She longed to get back to the farm. Much later, after her husband had died, she was persuaded to go as far as Lusaka to be presented to the Queen Mother, who, she proudly recalled, put sugar in her tea. When she first arrived on the farm, she had planted a huge orange orchard. She always served visitors with enormous juicy navel oranges with their tops sliced off and a sprig of leaves on top. Her husband had been a hunter rather than a farmer. There was a picture on the wall of him shooting an elephant. She herself had a baby leopard as a pet, and it used to sleep in her bed along with her husband. They had no children. After the man's death, she slept with a machete for self-defense. I visited her later with my fiancée Edith and with our colleague Elias Chipimo. By this time, her mind was becoming hazier. She asked Elias if the natives were quiet. He told her tactfully that they were. They weren't. A year or two later, the nephew who helped her run the farm moved her off to a farm outside Coloma, where we were later to live ourselves. By then she was in her dotage, sitting at home, eating sugar puffs. Meanwhile, the beautiful orange orchard had fallen into decay and been partially burned. Racism was blatant in Fort Jimmy in 1961. The post office had only recently been desegregated. The butcheries still advertised, quote, boys' meat, at 1 shilling and 4p a pound. Africans were not allowed to buy anything stronger than beer. I used to go and buy gin and whiskey at Camco stores for my friends. This and our attempts to invite our students to drama productions at the club and to have Africans in choral performances, including Handel's Messiah, were enough to get me labelled, as I proudly learned later, the first communist in Fort Jameson. Throughout the Rhodesias, anyone seen as too friendly with Africans had to be a communist. Here are some examples of the atmosphere. A white American couple came to work in the nearby game parks, and they brought their servant with them from Lusaka. The servant fell ill with VD, but was later diagnosed as having bilharzia. The wife went to visit him in the African hospital, taking him magazines to read. The next thing was that the gossip in town was that she was having an affair with her servant. Her family was shunned by all the whites. Their suspicions were increased when an official leaked that she'd also innocently inquired at the government offices about the procedure for taking this excellent servant to the United States. The happily married couple felt victimized and went back home. Another example was the day we called in on a farmer's wife, whom Edith knew from the church. She looked into the car, which was crammed with some of our students, and said, since there was just two of us, she'd like us to come in for tea. Again, an Anglican vicar, knowing our views, felt he had to justify that he felt his children had an inalienable right to sleep between sheets, as if some people didn't. On another occasion, our very well-spoken colleague, Carpenter Kafamukache, ran out of fuel and went to the nearest house for help, to be greeted with showers of dirty kaffa. At the agricultural show at Ndola, entrance fee for all 5 shillings, free samples of Nesquik were being handed out, only to whites. Andrew and June Kashita were the first mixed couple to return from England, where they had met. Andrew was a brilliant engineer who later served as a minister under Kaunda and Chiluba. He was the only black person on the ship, and they faced rudeness and hostility on the journey, and even after arriving in Northern Rhodesia. June used to enjoy leading the ladies on in the hairdressing saloon with their tales of Africans down from the trees, and then shocking them by saying she was married to one. The sight of Anna Chipimo, the first African woman to be seen driving a car, raised a lot of eyebrows in Fort Jameson. So this is section 4, Chizongwe Secondary School and the New Politics, 1961 to 64. I taught at 3 secondary schools in Northern Rhodesia, which then became Zambia. Chizongwe in Fort Jameson from 1961 until up to independence in 1964. Then Mufulira High School on the Copperbelt, just in 1965. and finally as head of the new Colombo Secondary School from 1966 to 1970. Chizongwe in 1961 was one of only 6 government senior secondary schools for boys in the country. This is how Cyrus Undi, who was in Form 4, described the school in the school magazine Aurora. "We come to the crest of our watchdog Chizongwe Hill. From here, Chizongwe's scenery is a semi-paradise. Immediately below the crest, green-painted, solid-looking corrugated iron roofs stand among lots of flat-topped green trees." The original plan had been to make this a co-educational boarding school, but Kaizore, the headman of the nearby village, protested successfully that if the school was enlarged, it would disturb the place where his ancestors were buried. Chizongwe was combined with a trades school which was teaching woodwork and metalwork. The boys came from all over the eastern province and even beyond. There was stiff competition in the final year of primary school, so the boys who were accepted were very bright, though there were few exceptions somehow got through the net. They were also old, some almost my age, and I was 25 at the time. Registration of births had not long been introduced, so short boys often pretended to be younger than they were to get into school. Later they needed to be a few years older again when they wanted to vote in the pre-independence election. The staff at the school were very talented, as there were few jobs open to educated Africans before independence, and teaching was one of them. Even driving a train was a job reserved for whites, rather to the amazement of the black engine driver who took over the trains when they entered the Belgian Congo. Carpenter Kafamukache, whom I had first met in London, only to find he was to be my neighbour at Chizongwe, had been the star pupil in his primary school in the northwestern province. He had the ability, as was later proved, to go to secondary school and university, but the missionaries were determined he should teach in their schools, and he made them attend their college for training primary teachers. He later escaped from their clutches and went for further study. Those Africans who persisted in their studies were outstanding individuals. Elias Chipima was one of them. Around the time of independence in 1964, they were creamed off to become senior civil servants, diplomats and senior managers. Elias was soon to become Zambian High Commissioner in London, and later the head of Standard Bank. I interviewed Elias shortly before he died, and his remarkable life story is in Annex 5 at the back of this book. Dalson Nkunika was our science teacher, and he later became head of scientific research in the country. Wesley Narenda, whom I had replaced as history teacher, had gone off to be head of a new secondary school at Monze, but he soon ended up as Speaker in the National Assembly, Speaker of Parliament. The headmaster was Alf King, a liberal-minded product of the Colonial Education Service, a warm-hearted man who was always a great support to all of his staff. Then we had a rather bored and boring American, whose house I shared for a short time. He did not like me much, but he wasn't used to unsliced bread, so he tolerated me and my bread knife. Menna Roberts was a very popular teacher of English who lived in the town, as did our excellent maths teacher, Anne Williamson, the wife of the local butcher. There was also a paranoid black South African, Jones Seo, a victim of the apartheid system who found it hard to trust any white person and believed he was being spied on all the time. Worse, he reported to the local UNIP party office that our African teachers were traitors, which was far from the truth. And on one occasion he stirred up some of the students whose slogan was "Down with Watt, we want Seo and Mrs. Roberts." The storm passed quickly and the students reverted to being very friendly. The bad name given to the Zambian teachers led me to write to Kenneth Kaunda, who was visiting the area, and he came to my house to hear our colleagues' side of the story. Seo soon left the school and the country. A year after my arrival, my social life brightened up with the arrival on the staff of Edith Hitchens to teach English and French. She came from a village near Cambridge, close to my home, and we got on very well from the start. It was kind of the Colonial Office to place us in the same school. As education officers, we were supposed to remain at our posts during the school holidays, but we managed to travel together a bit, to Blantyre in Nyasaland, it's now Malawi, officially to visit the dentist, where, to the amusement of Anne Williamson, we saw Ingmar Bergman's film, A Lesson in Love. We also had a memorable visit, in fact, to the north of Nyasaland, to the beautiful Nyika Plateau, where it was cold enough for a log fire in the rest house. I proposed to Edith one weekend on the shore of Lake Nyasa, that's now called Lake Malawi, and we arranged to get married on my home leave in 1964. Other arrivals on the school staff included Timothy Holmes, a poet who had fled from South Africa having buried his subversive books in the garden so as to avoid arrest when he left the country. He'd worked on Contact, the anti-apartheid journal run by Patrick Duncan in Cape Town. Another South African who joined us was the large and very friendly Livingston Ngobongwana, who had been working in Nigeria and who ended his life in Manchester. Later we were joined by a highly politicized teacher from SWAPO's liberation struggle in Namibia, Ottilie Abrahams. She successfully set up a students' union which radicalized some of the boys, who organized a strike, as a result of which some boys were expelled. Years later, I visited Potfa Kabandama, one of the most revolutionary ones from that group, by which time he'd become himself head of a secondary school and had a different perspective. Edith and I also met Ottilie again in Namibia in 2003, and I met her again in 2015 when she was still running her own school, was as lively, politically active and critical as ever. Local churchmen came to teach religious knowledge, the most notable of whom was Emmanuel Milingo, who was to become the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Zambia. A charismatic man, he became extremely popular, though not at the Vatican, because he performed exorcism and faith healing. He resigned and moved to Rome. He caused greater shock when later he married the leader of the Moonies. He also founded a movement to allow priests to marry. Unsurprisingly, he was excommunicated by the church. By this time, John Nelson, a Scottish former missionary, had become the head, and his wife Elizabeth taught English. She put together the successful production of Shakespeare's Macbeth, described below. Tulsi Ram, an Indian South African, also taught English. He was fanatical about English literature. He organized a Shakespeare evening at which the boys, deprived of girls as they were, got very excited by quotations from Romeo and Juliet. Another Indian arrived, but his high caste apparently prevented him from eating food prepared by a local cook. So he informed Mrs. Tulsi Ram that he would kindly allow her to cook for him. His rapid departure was a clear indication of Mrs. T's response. Chizongwe School had originally opened in 1955, and in 1960 there was a riot. The African population had been against the Federation from the start, and the reality of it proved even worse than they feared. The British government, hoping to save the Federation in some form, had set up the Monckton Commission in 1959 to collect the opinions of the people. Africans assumed that this would simply be a whitewash. The students, who were politically very aware, decided to strike. Elias Chipima had just started teaching at Chizongwe, and he told me, "It put me to tears because I had just been teaching for the first time in my life and I loved the children, and I just couldn't bear it. I tried to talk to them, but they wouldn't listen. There was an atmosphere, a resentment of anything pertaining to Federation. The politicians had brewed it up, and the students were burning with it in their hearts. The Monckton Commission was going to sit at Chizongwe, and the students would not accept that. So the school was closed. 218 boys were expelled. By the time I arrived in 1961, the political temperature was still high, and some rural primary schools were being set alight as part of the Cha-Cha-Cha. The rebellion by the charismatic Lumpa Church, led by the prophetess Alice Lenshina, was also creating a lot of tension further north. For a few weeks we had a night patrol at the school, which consisted of one teacher and a few students armed with torches walking around the premises. Chizongwe was a different world from Fort Jameson town, though even at the school colonial planning had resulted in a few spacious houses up the hill, meant for white teachers, and some more recent so-called African graduate houses where I lived. The latter had more bedrooms and gloss paint halfway up the walls. African families were deemed to be larger and their kids might mess up the walls. I employed a cook called Gordon. I did not like the idea of employing someone, but I accepted that domestic service was a major source of employment, and I was not used to cooking on a wood fire. Gordon also insisted that we also hired by Don, a garden boy, whose job was to chop firewood, polish the floor, and help with the washing up. In a letter home I wrote, "My cook and garden boy are paid by me at an appallingly low rate. The cook gets £5 a month and the garden boy 30 shillings. The cook gets a free house. At the moment he is living in a round brick hut with a thatched roof, but as soon as a proper tin-roofed house is free he will move there. The garden boy I would not have employed at all, except that cooks think it's beneath their dignity to chop firewood." The garden was small, but we cultivated pumpkins. Bidon sat around most of the time, but he came into his own when Gordon had drunk too much beer, a traditional brew made from maize, or cachasu, a much stronger drink, distilled often using rusty cans. In 1962, the country was more than ever in a state of political excitement, and our students were infected by this. Relations between Sir Roy Welensky, now the Federal Prime Minister, and the British government had grown worse after the visit of the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan to Zambia in 1960. Carpenter Cuff Mukachi had been among the educated Africans presented to him. Macmillan had gone on to make his famous speech in South Africa where he said, "The wind of change is blowing through this continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact." And he referred to our own deep convictions about the political destinies of free men to which in our own territories we are trying to give effect. This signal from Macmillan, along with the fact that the Monckton Commission's report was not in the end a whitewash, meant that the Federation could no longer be imposed upon the population. It therefore became likely that in the end, Britain would respect the protectorate status of Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, despite the strong pressure in the Conservative Party not to let the settlers down. Insistence from Africa and at the United Nations led to agreement to hold an election in 1962 to try to square the circle. Complex electoral rules, described as a dog's breakfast, were concocted with an upper roll of voters who were mainly whites, a lower roll of Africans with a certain level of education or wealth and status, voting in 15 constituencies each. Then there were 7 national constituencies where there had to be a certain proportion from both rolls to fill the seats. One further seat was reserved for Asians, mostly the Indian shopkeepers and businessmen and their families. The total number of registered voters was only 130,000 in the whole country. I volunteered to be a registering officer for the 1962 election, and the government provided me with a pile of registration forms. Chiefs and headmen were allowed to complete the form in a local language, in this case Chinyanja. I was sent to Chief Jumbe's area in the Luangwa Valley to register villagers. I was provided with a Land Rover loaded with deck chairs, tables and camp beds, and 2 messengers. They wanted to provide me with a cook, but I took Gordon with me. I was not accustomed to behaving like a big white bwana, and when the messengers would stamp their feet and salute me, I just smiled weakly back at them. We camped at a small thatched government rest house. The would-be voters had to have tax receipts and be able to complete the registration forms by themselves, though we were advised to be helpful. Even in the local language, the form was complicated, and these people were not used to filling forms. I helped 3 delightful elderly chiefs complete their forms. This area was just outside the game reserve. In those days there were many more animals around, and we met a colossal snake which straddled the road, and the 2 messengers jumped out of their skins. Back in Fort Jameson, I spent many evenings at the local UNIP office registering supporters, continuing to be extra helpful. Literacy is a senseless criterion for the vote. Many of these illiterate people were politically highly aware. I remember one poor woman who'd sat up all night to practice writing the magic words on her form, finally copying the letters one by one. By the end, I'd registered 128 voters. I have a letter from the electoral officer congratulating us on exceeding the target. He might have been surprised how it was done. 4 national parties contested the election. The almost entirely white United Federal Party, UFP, the African National Congress, led by Harry Nkumbula, the original nationalist party, which was strong only among the Tonga and Ila people of the south of the country, UNIP, led by Kenneth Kaunda, and the multiracial Liberal Party, led by Sir John Moffat. I attended 2 election meetings. At the VMI Club, some slightly drunken white men were taunting Mrs. E. F. M. Randolph, the white candidate who was standing for the ANC on the upper row. She tried to explain that the reason Africans opposed federation was that its capital was in Salisbury, which is now Harare in Zimbabwe. "Why not move it then?" bawled somebody. The Liberal Party meeting was even odder. Sir John Moffat was leaning on the bar in the scruffy multiracial club and exuding pessimism. He addressed us lady and gentlemen, as the crowd comprised Edith and me and 3 others. Before the election, the ANC had done a deal with the United Federal Party, which allowed it to win 4 seats in the national constituencies, which added to their 3 on the lower roll in the southern and central provinces gave them the balance of power. They could either collaborate with UNIP, which won 12 seats on the lower roll, or with the UFP with its 13 seats on the upper roll. The multiracial Liberal Party, which was supposed to be in the electoral law to hold the balance of power, won no seats and very few votes. Many of the more liberal whites actually voted UNIP. After the results were announced, UNIP managed to persuade the ANC to break its pact with the UFP and join with them to form an African majority. My friend Alan Jarvis happened to be at Harry Nkumbula's house in Lusaka that day, and he was very proud of his ballpoint pen, which was used to seal the deal which brought Kenneth Kaunda to power as Prime Minister. This deal, together with the earlier triumph of Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda in Nyasaland, meant that the Federation was now doomed. It was brought to a quiet death on the 31st of December 1963, after only 10 years of life. Africans celebrated. The Chizongwe boys happily sang, Yata Fedulo, the Federation is finished. That wasn't the end of politics. Before independence, there had to be another election, and this time there was no literacy or property qualification, and everyone could register for the vote. There was an air of excitement. Edith, who was not quite my fiancée yet, and I were both polling officers, for which we were paid an extra £6 6 I first collected ballot boxes and other equipment from town in my old Peugeot 203 car. Each party's symbol was pasted on the box so that illiterate people could simply put their voting slip in the box of their choice. It was a hoe for UNIP, a lion for the ANC, an alarm clock for independent candidates. There was indelible red ink into which each voter's finger had to be dipped, Pond's Beauty tissues to dry the ink, a Bible for swearing in of polling assistants, and sealing wax for sealing the ballot boxes after the vote. The ballot boxes were placed inside the polling booth, and in spite of some civic education programs, some voters had no idea what to do with the ballot paper, trying to push it under the lid and calling out, "Will somebody come and open this box for me?" Voters were supposed to have a registration form or some other form of identification. Husbands were allowed to identify their wives, which could be a problem when they had several. Edith wrote to her parents, "I had a very small polling station with 475 voters on my roll. Only 20 didn't vote. We had a 96% poll, and this was general all over the country. Everybody looked happy and important as they came to register their vote, and everybody came early. On the morning of the first day, there was a queue of about 100, nearly all the time. After 1 p.m., only 40 more people came. In the bigger stations, the rush lasted all day on the Monday, and people had to be turned away in the evening to come the following day. The poll lasted 2 days because some stations are in areas with very scattered population. In some areas, rivers have flooded. It was the height of the rainy season. A friend called in to say he'd had to wade through a river shoulder high with his ballot box on his head. The Chizongwe students were at a pitch of excitement as the results came in. Each time UNIT won a seat, 55 of them in fact, a big cheer would go up. When the ANC won, 10 in the southern and central provinces, there was sniggers or silence. There were 10 reserved constituencies for voters with higher qualifications. The National Progressive Party, which was the old UFP under a new name, won all of them. Kaunda and his youthful but impressive cabinet were sworn in shortly afterwards. Chizongwe was a typical colonial school with many of the aspects of a British boarding school. The boys' dormitories formed 4 houses, which competed on sports day. The houses were named after 2 African heroes, Agre, the famous Ghanaian educationalist, and Chuma, who had worked for David Livingstone and helped carry his body to the coast when he died, and 2 colonialists, Rhodes and Gilbert Rennie, or Rennie House, the former governor of Northern Rhodesia. Prefects were appointed and became quite powerful, supervising punishment, which was usually hard work in the school grounds, slashing the tall grass or digging holes to plant trees. Food was always a sensitive subject. One boy was elected as the Minister of Food, and he would negotiate with the boarding master to get the best deal. At Chizongwe, meals normally consisted of either nshima, which is maize porridge, and beans, or less frequently rice and meat. Cocoa, masokoni, scones or rather bread rolls really, and fruit were also provided. In fact, it compared reasonably well with what the boys would have eaten at home. There was little chance for most of the students to leave the school premises in term time. The vanette, a small brown Bedford lorry, would take a few boys to town to do shopping on a Saturday. It would also carry football teams to play at Katete, the Dutch Reformed Church school 50 miles distant, or even further to the Catholic one at Chassa. When the school holidays came, boys who wanted to stay with relatives on the line of rail had to apply for a government pass. There was no free movement from the outlying provinces to the main towns. Some students stayed at school over the December holidays if their schools were too far away or were liable to be cut off by floods. January was the height of the rainy season. Since at first most of us had no car, the staff would also ride to town sitting in deck chairs on the back of the vanette. During term time, we organised a film show at weekends, often documentaries from the British Council, such as one about the royal children, then Charles, Anne and Andrew, or from the French Cultural Centre, such as Giraffe à Paris. I remember laughing one day when the students were served with the life history of the cockroach, while at the White Club in town they were showing Brides of Dracula. On another occasion, I remember hearing loud cheers coming from the classrooms that served as a hall, to find that it was a film about ballet. The boys assumed that lifting up the ballerina was a prelude to sex. Feature films were sometimes shown. Laurence Olivier's Richard III went down very well. Boys limped around the school with their backs hunched for weeks. It gave them some idea for the school production of Macbeth, which was performed in our open-air amphitheatre on an evening in a cool and drizzly night, as drizzly as it ever was in Dunsinane. Our feisty Scots teacher of English, Elizabeth Nelson, unlocked a lot of acting talent among the students. The part of Macbeth himself was shared between two players, and, as in Shakespeare's time, Lady Macbeth had to be played by a boy. It was whispered, in fact, that the boy in question was already married. The students loved it, and quotes from the play were heard around the school. "Macbeth hath murdered sleep," and "Is this a dagger which I see before me?" We spent long hours recording sound effects, and I trained myself to do the stage lighting. Another play we put on in 1964 in the new Assembly Hall was Bertolt Brecht's The Exception and the Rule. The students organised regular concerts at weekends, and they were brilliant. The best group was the Maddie Kids, featuring 5 juniors, including Kafumu son. The songs were interpretations of songs they'd presumably heard over the radio, ranging from Roy Orbison to Carmen Miranda and Miriam Makeba. Quela, a jazzy sort of street music played on the penny whistle of Spokes Mashiane, was also very popular. Some of the staff joined a choir in the town, led by a very charismatic priest from Quebec. The first performance was of Handel's Messiah, and the students were invited to St. Anne's Catholic Cathedral for it. They were very impressed, and they all came back to school singing the Hallelujah Chorus. The choir later performed Haydn's Creation and Mendelssohn's Elijah. Around this time, a visiting charitable optical service arrived at the school. A majority of students claimed they needed glasses, which were the sure sign of being an intellectual. We managed to whittle the numbers down to 15 who had real eyesight problems, and they received free spectacles. I enjoyed teaching at Chizongwe. The students were very keen and, with exceptions, very intelligent. In another letter home I wrote soon after my arrival, "I have to keep ahead of the classes in all the subjects, and in geography I cannot always babble on unless I have vaguely prepared the subject. Civics is even worse, as I'm dealing with agriculture without ever having lived in an African village. History I only teach to the remove, the equivalent of English 14-year-olds in academic achievements, but rather more adult in outlook. Some of them must be getting on for 20. They have so far had the French Revolution and agitation for parliamentary reform in England, so they've learnt plenty of subversive ideas. I learned a huge amount from our outstanding African colleagues before they were creamed off to top jobs in the new Zambia, and also from our students, many of whom have remained friends. Chizongwe produced some high flyers. Dennis Chirwa became Deputy Chief Justice. Yobert Shamapande became an expert at the United Nations Institute for Namibia. Also, he was head of UN Information Office in South Africa and a professor at Columbia University. Alfred Sakala, who became a senior manager at the copper mines. Austin Mwemba, who became a permanent secretary. Ambassadors Bizwayo Nkunika and Solomon Mumbi, and many others, including the writer Gideon Piri, who covered the Nigerian Civil War as a journalist and wrote a popular novel called A Ticklish Sensation. Although I was happy to move elsewhere after 3 years, my first posting is the one I remember most fondly. In 2009, Edith and I revisited Chipata, taking the post bus along the greatly improved tarred Great East Road over the Luangwa Bridge, rebuilt in 1968, after it had been sabotaged as revenge for Kaunda's stand against the racist regime in Southern Rhodesia. It was sad to see that the hillside which Cyrus had praised in 1961 was now bare of trees. The school had become Chizongwe Technical High School, and it was still one of the best, and the head was amazed to learn that we'd been taught there before he was even born. Although life at a boarding school was a step away from African reality, we had opportunities to learn a bit about the culture. The 1-year-old baby of Paul Gondwe, one of the trade school staff, died. The funeral was to take place at the nearest village, and the school vanette was used as the hearse. I joined the crowd of mourners as a tiny coffin was loaded onto the back of the lorry. Paul and his wife, who was howling with grief, climbed in, and the other women followed. The growl of the lorry's engine in low gear competed with the higher pitch of the wailing women as we moved along the muddy path to the village. The sun came out and we were surrounded by green maize, tall grass and trees, but we were infected by the spirit of the dead child. Kaizore, the garrulous old village headman, was master of ceremonies at this funeral. The men stood at one end of the pit, and the women sank to the ground at the other, and Paul crouched by the grave. Carpenter Kafamukache read from the Bible and gave a short sermon in Bemba, which the locals would not have understood very well. In spite of this and the little white cross on the coffin, it did not feel like a Christian occasion. Kaizore was like a second priest, indicating when the baby's bottle should be pierced with a hoe and thrown into the grave, along with a jar of Vaseline. He stuck little sticks in the ground once the grave had been covered, and at his bidding the women went off to collect stones to cover up the mound. It was a moving experience for me. Such rites prolong grief, but bring out tremendous solidarity from all the community. Zambian names and Zambian English. One of the many strange effects of colonial and missionary influence has been the grafting of European-sounding names onto African traditions of naming children. We asked students at Chizongwe in 1963 and in Kalomo in 1969 how they got their names. Alice Mulwani, a student at Kalomo, wrote, "In our tribe, the Tonga, names are given by your grandmother. While you're a child, you'll be called by that name you are given until you start school, or when they baptize you, they give you a Christian name." Gilbert Hibenzu, also Tonga, wrote, "The name given to the firstborn, if at all he is a boy, is his grandfather's. A girl is given his grandmother's. All the others that are born after are named after a thing that happened when they were born, or the season when they were born, or what their father did when the wife was pregnant. Samson Namadula was given the name Samson by his father, and the name Shasha, meaning handsome, by his mother, and Kungubala, meaning lazy, by his grandfather. He said he stopped using Kungubala because I am not lazy as 13 years ago." Zambian families often keep a family name, which is not the case all over Central Africa. Children were often named after someone, often a missionary, a pastor, or a doctor at the child's birth. One boy's father insisted that he had to be called London. The parents and the children, when reaching school-going age, would choose names that sounded European, and then they invented similar-sounding names. Thus at Chizongwe we had Jackson, but we also had Fraxon, Laxon, Maxon, and Waxon. Girls could be Endless, Loveness, Fatness, Fedness, or Ettiness. Some of these names were hard to take seriously. For example, we had Hilarious, Bilious, and Belt. Of course, at baptism, many children were given biblical names or saints' names. Francis, Elias, Elijah, Joshua, Benignus, Jeremiah, Solomon. I remember once calling Goliath into the staff room. Edith was surprised to see a rather small and not very muscular boy come in. He went on to become the director of the Central Supply and Tender Board. My favourite sad tale was of a bright boy who lined up to be baptised at the Anglican Church in Fort Jameson. And when he reached the font, the priest asked his name. "Sunboy," he replied. "I can't baptise you as Sunboy. You are James." After the service, Sunboy was in tears. "My brother is called James." There had never been a Saint Sunboy. English is the common language in Zambia today, although Bemba and an urban version of Nyanja, known as Chitauni, town language, were widely used, or are widely used, in fact. Before independence, fewer people used English, but those that had been to school usually spoke it very well, often better than their first teachers in the primary school. Chad Kawamba writes in Aurora, which was the school magazine at Chizongwe, "English is composed of so many rhyming words that it's sometimes difficult to make the whole difference of either being understood or not. I know when most of us began to learn to speak English, we found some peculiar type of pronunciation which we'd never had to make in our mother languages. Pronunciation, and therefore spelling, is of course influenced by the local languages, which are members of the huge family of Bantu languages. Zambia theoretically has 70 languages, but most are very close to the 7 major ones: Bemba, Nyanja, Tonga, Lozi, Kaonde, Lunda, and Luvale. The letter R usually becomes L, and the vowel sounds are very pure compared to some of the English ones. This had the effect on students' spelling. The tool shed inventory at Chizongwe School read, hard blooms, soft blooms, small garden folks, large garden folks, and muttocks, of course meaning hard brooms, etc. So cows ate glass, beds flew into their nests, and people sat in a shed under a tree. He reached a rich man's house, for example. As Zambian words usually ended in a vowel, the clipped ending of English words was difficult, so you could hear iti isu a gudu road. But the ends of some words, such as dignity and custody, posed problems. Police held some of our Coloma boys in custard. Generally, our students had very good English, but of course there were some howlers, and we noted some of them in a book in the staff room at Chizongwe. Quite understandably, the students resented being laughed at, and sometimes they removed the book. The students also got their revenge by mimicking the foibles of the staff. I was known as Gaucho, and the boys used to imitate me walking along with my thumbs in my pockets. The recommendations for applicants for secondary school made by the primary school heads sometimes needed decoding. Among the special peculiarities of one highly recommended boy was hideous character. The headmaster was about to reject him when Dalton Kunika worked out that he meant shy, someone who hides. Some other gems from Ufalira. He claims to possess a fractured leg. Or, it appears he has been brought up loosely. Or, he plays truancy at its uttermost. Very good at football, but fond of dodging. The use and quality of English has increased greatly since the time I worked there, especially in the towns. But there are some distinctly Zambian usages. For example, the time is always given in the 24-hour clock, and if someone was late, it meant he was dead. The downside of this is that the main national languages, although spoken, are written and read much less, while some of the smaller languages, as all over Africa, face a threat to their survival. Before independence, books were published in some of the local languages. This is rare today. Since culture and language are inseparable, this has to be a matter for concern. Other things changed quite fast after independence. The country started feeling African. Africans filled most jobs at all levels. Those who did well, the Apamwamba, top people, built houses, bought cars, and many grew fat. I remember the satirical columnist in the African Mail suggesting that beer should be piped into people's houses as well as water. And this letter appeared in the African Mail. The heading is, "A Stern Warning to Zambian Women." This business of women prime ministers is a threat to stable marriages. I must warn Zambian women not to divorce their husbands with the hope of kissing their way to premiership. We in Zambia will not tolerate it. Signed, Chisenga Y. Kobili in Chingola. Independence for Malawi and Zambia. I was due to go home for 6 months' leave in late July 1964, and Edith and I were to be married in October. As her contract was with the colonial government, Zambia's imminent independence meant that she could break it and go on leave. We were going to miss the festivities in Lusaka, so we went across the recently recreated border to experience Malawi's independence celebrations on July the 6th. It was a remarkable weekend. A friend dropped us at the railway station at Salima on the shore of Lake Malawi, the same place where we had decided to get married a few months earlier. The train was actually overtaken by a man on a bicycle, but it eventually speeded up slightly and got us to Balaka, where the line crosses the main road. We hitchhiked from there to Zomba, the small, sleepy and rather charming town on the side of a mountain, very much like a hill station in British India, which was then the capital of Malawi, but is now the university town. We stayed with Anthony and Anne Wilson. Anthony was head of the Community Development Department. He took us to Blantyre to watch the independence ceremony. The loudspeakers kept proudly trumpeting the arrival of the Duke of Edinburgh, husband of the Queen. The Union Jack came down, and the new rising sun flag of Malawi reached the top of the flagpole. The face of the new Prime Minister, Dr. Hastings Banda, lit up in the fireworks, and a big cheer went up. The following morning, we took a little bus from Zomba to Blantyre for our flight back to Fort Jameson. Halfway along the road, all traffic was stopped to wait for the Prime Minister and the Duke of Edinburgh to pass. As the cortege passed, we must have looked like a couple of old local farmers. We missed the plane, but we were very lucky to hitchhike a lift back in time to get to school the next day. Sadly, things turned sour in Malawi within weeks. The leading members of the Malawi Congress Party had built up Dr. Banda as a dominant leader to create national unity before independence, without realizing they'd created a monster. When 6 members of the cabinet dared to raise issues with the Prime Minister, soon to become president for life, they were accused of treason and they had to escape into hiding or into exile. Anthony Wilson wrote in November 1964, quote, "Friend no longer trusts friend. Families are divided. People disappear over the Zambian border or into restriction. Dr. Banda incites violence in his speeches, and his youth groups respond, feeling secure against police interference. While the ministers who resigned seem to want to do no more than spark off a debate, the Prime Minister has regarded this as a slight to his leadership and therefore treason." A little bit later on our honeymoon, we met the Malawian ambassador, David Rubadiri, in Washington, and he offered us the use of his flat in New York. The wall was decorated with a huge photograph of Dr. Banda. The following year, David, who was an academic and one of Africa's best-known poets, was also branded a traitor, and he spent most of his life in exile. Edith and I spent a day in Malawi in 2009. We were shown around the new capital city at Lilongwe, built with aid from the apartheid regime in South Africa. It's a fairly undemonstrative place, and the old capital on the hillside of Zomba would have been too difficult to make into a modern capital. Dr. Banda, who created the new Lilongwe, still has admirers, one of whom is the custodian of the rather ugly mausoleum, which many regard as a tribute to the father of the nation, while opponents see it as a monument to a dictator and a waste of money. More recently, I spent Christmas 2015 in Malawi with Fetson Kalua, who was a Tumbuka from the north of the country, found no work in Malawi and ended up as a professor in Pretoria, South Africa. We stayed on the lakeshore at the home of Chimuntu Banda, who had been Speaker in the National Parliament. Zambia was to be much luckier, having as its first leader Kenneth Kaunda, KK, a more modest, sincere man. On the 24th of October, when KK became president of the new Republic of Zambia, we were on our honeymoon and we were in Los Angeles. Some Zambian contacts there invited us to a rather strange party at a hotel in Santa Monica. The Americans present had little idea where Zambia was, so the hosts had to organize a map ceremony to fill that gap, and everyone had a few drinks to toast the new country. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the team that had entered the Olympic Games in the name of Northern Rhodesia left it on Independence Day, proudly carrying the new flag of Zambia. A year on the Copperbelt, 1965. After our wedding and a long honeymoon in the United States and Mexico, Edith and I returned to Zambia, as it has now become. In January 1965, we were posted to Mufulira High School. Mufulira is one of the 4 copper mining towns, which, together with the administrative industrial centre Ndola, form the Copperbelt. Mufulira Mine was the largest and deepest of the mines. The town was segregated into 4 parts. The mine township and the town both had low density, originally all white, sections, and high density, all black sections. The copper company was paternalistic and provided a good hospital, schools, and reasonable housing for the black mining families. There were lots of whites, many of them miners and many from South Africa. We were given a spacious house in a leafy street of comfortable bungalows, guarded by fierce dogs whose license tag read European-owned dog, and which tended to attack anyone on foot. Whites generally moved in cars. Behind the houses there was what's called a sanitary lane, which linked the servants' quarters. Mufulira High School had been all white until 1963, and we arrived with the first large intake of black pupils in Form 1. We had resisted being posted to this school, as we would have preferred a boarding school, and we found, as we feared, that the culture of the place was that of the old Federal Ministry of Education. The teacher's uniform was long trousers and a tie. The colonial white shirt and shorts were thought to be shocking. Prepared lesson notes had to be shown to the head, and Afrikaans was on the syllabus, taught by a Mrs. van der Walt, generally dubbed Mrs. van der Homework. John Harker, the head, had grown up in Natal, South Africa, and he thought he was a liberal, but he'd evidently never met any Africans socially. So when Simon Maonde, later to be Zambia's ambassador in China, joined our staff, Harker was pleasantly surprised to find one who could speak good English. Then Joe Mwemba came from the ministry to inspect the school. That made 2 of them. Alan Jarvis, Edith and I, who had moved from African education, were part of a creeping black advance that Harker seemed unhappy with. Integrating the pupils didn't come easily. Most of the black kids had walked miles to get to school with little or no breakfast. The relatively few white kids in the first year were driven to school or lived nearby. They were mostly younger and well fed. The result, the blacks were quiescent and wanted to study. The whites bounced around with excess energy and disturbed the class. Harker had to be persuaded to provide bread rolls, masokono, at break, and each time he announced this, he had to point out that they were totally without flavour. The African pupils enjoyed them anyway. We quickly got depressed. It was very boring teaching the same lesson to 6 streams in Form 1. The head treated the staff like bad children. One day we took President Kaunda's advice to display maximum festivity for the state visit of Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, and we went off to Kitwe to wave at the great man, thereby failing to complete some students' reports on time. I was reprimanded by the head and rudely stormed out of his office. On another occasion, I had spent the evening in the pub across the Congo border, and when I got home found our bedroom door lock broken. I had to explain humbly why I was wearing dirty clothes and no tie in school. Edith had been at a meeting that evening and was wearing high heels and a smart dress. In the school stock cupboard we found a booklet first published in 1946 entitled Understand the African, used by the Federal Ministry of Education to teach white children about African life and culture. The author, J.M. Winterbottom, describes visiting a village and writes about chiefs and traditions. He may have meant well, but the booklet really exposes the prejudices of the time. Here are some examples. Africans can be educated to do the same jobs as Europeans, but if the European, with centuries of civilization behind him, cannot do them better than the African, then it is right that the African should get the job. But what people who use this argument are afraid of is not that the African will do the job better, but he will do it for less money. Because he does not want so many things as a European. He is content with fewer and cheaper clothes. He eats cheaper and less nourishing food. He lives in smaller and worse-built houses. And again, the African looks for guidance to the European. Even when he is insolent and rude, he realizes that the European has wisdom and power and wealth. And the very last words in the book, tell the truth, even if most Africans tell lies. You should know better. That generalized individual, the African, is described in his quaint cultural context, and the young European has his imagined superiority confirmed, although the author might wish him to be a little less arrogant. Being only a few miles from the Congo border was a boon for burglars, but the local police were often able to retrieve things. But not in the case of our neighbour's car, which was found one morning propped up on bricks with all the 4 wheels missing. One good thing about being close to the border was a chance to go across and drink Simba beer in Mokambo with some very friendly and often drunken Congolese, as on the night when our bedroom door was locked. Edith and I also had a weekend in Elizabethville, which is now called Lubumbashi, still an elegant town at that time. Another weekend we crossed the Congo Pedicle to Fort Rosebery and Samfia, where the wide sandy beach looks at what appears to be the sea. It is in fact Lake Bangweulu, so wide and flat that the far side of it cannot be seen. The Congo Pedicle is another colonial absurdity. If you look at a map of Zambia, you'll see this strip of land in the shape of a foot, which effectively cuts off northern Zambia from the Copperbelt. The road across it was theoretically, but never, maintained by the Congo. It was a mass of mud in the rainy season and deeply rutted in the dry season. Worse, drivers were supposed to change over to driving on the right for these 42 miles. This crazy demarcation of the frontier was the work of the King of Italy, who had mediated between the claims of King Leopold of Belgium and the British South Africa Company in 1894. Of course, neither king had ever visited Africa. To keep myself sane, I began teaching an adult evening class. We joined the town branch of UNIP, and I applied for school headships all over the country. One day, visiting the amateur theatre in nearby Kitwe, I saw they were advertising for a newsreader for Zambia television, which at that time only broadcast from a little studio in Kitwe. Just 2 hours work a week for a fee of £3. I got the job. They tested me reading commercials, but I was too bad an actor to sound convinced of the wonders of soap powder. However, I had a good BBC-type voice, and for a couple of months I read the news every Thursday. I still have a continuity sheet dated the 8th of June 1965, when Chow En-lai was visiting President Nyerere, the Viet Cong were blowing up a bridge, and 2 students in Rhodesia fined for heckling the Prime Minister, Ian Smith. Then one Thursday I broke a tooth eating some dates and worried that this would be the end of my career on ZTV. We studied the faces of other newsreaders and were relieved to discover that their teeth, or lack of them, did not show. The 11th of November 1965 was also a Thursday, the day of Ian Smith's Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI, in Rhodesia. Edith set up a tape recorder at the house to record my voice, announcing the event. But my boss wanted to read the big story, and I was just left with the small stuff, a new open-cast coal mine in the Zambezi Valley. Shortly after this, ZTV decided, quite ractly, to appoint an African to read the news. This was the end of my very brief broadcasting career. Section 8, Kalomo Secondary School, 1966-70. My search for a headship bore fruit. I was first told that I would be sent to Mpatamatu, which was a new day secondary school in the nearby copper-belt town of Luanshya. Happily, the Ministry of Education changed its mind, and I ended up as head of Kalomo Secondary School in the southern province of Zambia. The lack of educated manpower in the new Zambia was shocking. At independence, there were fewer than 100 Zambian graduates and less than 1,000 people who had completed secondary education. The government's big plan was to build a large coeducational secondary boarding school in each district and a new day secondary school in all the towns. By 1971, the number of pupils finishing Form 2 would increase from 2,700 to 17,500. The number passing O-level would increase from 500 to 9,000, and the University of Zambia would open. This lack of qualified Zambians meant that a 29-year-old like me could be selected to run one of these new schools. Kaunda's new government was ambitious, building and equipping so many new schools, as well as plenty of other development projects in a landlocked country with a hostile regime in Rhodesia to the south. Fuel supplies rationed, was bound to cause immense logistical problems. We visited Kalomo a month before the school was due to open, the very weekend when Zambia's fuel supplies were being cut by Rhodesia, whose illegal regime was now being targeted by international sanctions. We left the car in Lusaka, continued to Kalomo by train, and hitchhiked back again. Most of the school buildings had been erected, but it was clear that the school was not going to open on time in the new year. Edith then went on a visit to her family in England, and in January 1966 I drove south with Zulu, who worked for us, he was a cook, and a load of luggage and a cat. Sure enough, there were no desks in the classrooms, no beds in the dormitories, and no electricity. My first task was to hire labour. A queue of 200 applicants formed, and there were only 9 jobs. I set up a temporary office, using the only 2 chairs I had. The movable back seat of our little Renault car had to serve as furniture in my house. When the school finally opened in February, we had 140 pupils, all boys, all boarders, 6 classrooms, 4 storerooms, 4 dormitories, and a huge unfinished dining hall. 140 beds, 139 mattresses, 48 desks, 50 chairs, and some tiny borrowed chairs from a primary school. Electricity arrived on the opening day, though the wiring was all mixed up. To cook meals, we had to borrow 2 colossal cauldrons and buy firewood, using one of the dormitories as a dining room. Yet because we were on the railway line and on the main road, we were much better off than other schools in outlying places. Gradually things got sorted out, including the arrival of sophisticated oil-burning cookers and the completion of enough buildings for the eventual roll of 1,000 students. Kalomo was the sort of place that in South Africa would be called a dorp, a small township with a few stores, churches and a police station and not much more. T.R.R. Nair, who was a new teacher who'd worked in Aden, described Kalomo as an uplifted village. Its most attractive feature was a large green open space in front of the row of shops. This was known as the village green, or more often the green village, with a huge fig tree in one corner. There was an old hotel where we had stayed on our earlier visit, run by the aged Mrs. Horton, who had arrived in a covered wagon as a young woman. The hotel was scruffy, but had no breakfast. "There isn't the demand," she said. It's still scruffy today, and the bar is even seedier than when I remember it. Alan Franks was one of the teachers who joined the staff in 1967. When told he was going to work in Kalomo, he looked at his father's ancient encyclopedia It contained a map of northwestern Rhodesia, whose capital city, Colombo, was in bold type. I drove him down from Lusaka when he arrived. We passed through the other small towns, and each time I had to tell him that Colombo was even smaller. But it had truly been the capital. The old administrator's house, built in 1903, and the Pioneer Cemetery are at a distance from the small modern town, but both are listed as national monuments. When the railway was extended over the Zambezi River to Colombo in 1905, and then on to Ndola and the Congo in 1909, a wide strip on each side of the line was declared Crown land and made available to immigrant European farmers. In 1907, Colombo lost its status as the capital to Livingstone, but it remained a commercial centre for the farmers, with a couple of churches, a primary school for whites, and later one for Asians and another for Africans. A memorial beside the main road commemorates the Colombo culture, which ran from 800 to 1300 of our common era, of which more later. Colombo was also the driving test capital of Zambia. People came from all over the country for this. There was nowhere for a hill start, and the rather beery white man who administered the driving test rarely failed anybody. I hope this was not the cause of the high number of accidents on the hell run along the Great North Road to Dar es Salaam, the lifeline of Zambia's trade when sanctions were opposed by Rhodesia. A bizarre event in Colombo in 1966 was the arrival of a really old-fashioned circus, marquee, trapeze artists, a lion tamer, and all. It was during the school holidays, but the local people crowded in. The weirdest thing was to see this white South African band playing the Zambian national anthem. This was the last visit of the circus to Zambia. Edith edited a history of our 5 years at Colombo, based on weekly letters home that her mother had preserved, along with some from me to my mother, and much of this chapter is based on this detailed record. In those days, even to telephone Lusaka meant booking a call and waiting hours to be connected. In these days of text, tweets and Skype, it is extraordinary to think that in 10 years in Zambia we never once called home on the telephone. Post was efficient and we just exchanged regular letters. We were able to travel during the school holidays and visited Malawi, Tanzania, Rhodesia as it was, and South Africa, as well as most parts of Zambia. We also had some practice as acting parents when Arthur Maonde, aged 7, stayed with us so that he could attend the English medium primary school. His father was head of a similar school to mine at the more isolated town of Namwala. Each of the first 140 boys to come to the new school had to struggle to get there. Scriven Masole writes, "Competition to get into secondary school was so great that when the results of the entrance exam were announced, those pupils who had been accepted had to hide in the teachers' houses because the less fortunate ones were so jealous and they wanted to stone them. We were 7 teachers, all British, and apart from Edith and me, new to the country. The boys were excited to be there, happy to see there were no fees, even soap and toilet paper were government issue. Edward Sakofiwa noted that one of the advantages of being the first pupils at a new school, we did not go through what is commonly known as mockery. Although the boys who made up the first intake had to rough it, formed a happy community. Yet it could be mind-blowing for students first arriving in secondary school, especially those coming from other parts of the country. Instead of a Zambian class teacher pronouncing English in a familiar African way, faced with 7 or 8 foreign teachers with their different accents, and they loved taking us off when we were out of earshot. They were convinced that Bill Bleeks had some speech defect. In fact, he just came from Northern Ireland. After the first year, the origins of the Colombo staff became more diverse. They used to keep asking Ramesh Sharma a question that would make him repeat words they thought he could not pronounce. One Indian teacher at another school was dubbed Physics and Chemistry Patel. Our own Mr. Patel was famous for exclaiming, "If I would be in Nigeria, I would hammer you." We had a variety of South Africans, both coloureds and Indians, both Christian, Hindu and Muslim, all happy to escape from teaching under the apartheid regime. Other teachers were part of the aid programs of Denmark and Norway, as well as the large number of British. Our Russian science teacher had to report to his embassy at regular intervals. His wife was also a highly qualified scientist, but she had no English, and she was bored out of her mind with nothing to do. They managed to communicate with the only other Russian speaker in Colombo, an eccentric elderly Armenian dating from before the revolution, who had orthodox religious icons all over his house. A strange friendship probably best not reported to the embassy. When we needed a teacher of Tonga, the local language, we headhunted Joshua Trillo from a primary school, and we soon had him promoted to be deputy head. At Coloma, out of a staff of over 30, we never had more than 4 Zambian teachers during my time there. One of these was Naomi Sikumba, who taught domestic science. Her husband, Cox, was later Zambian ambassador to Mozambique, and tragically he died in the air crash that killed President Samora Machel. Another was Raja Kunda, who went into politics and later held several ministerial posts. As at Chizongwe, food was always a sensitive issue. In the first year, when we had no African staff, Rosemary Derwent-Crowther, who was a trained home economics teacher, was asked to organise the boarding. Her idea of a meal was not the same as that of the boys, nor was she used to having food cooked in a huge cauldron in the open air. We had to adjust the portions to respond to the boys' reasonable complaints. Equally, the domestic science syllabus took little account of African tastes. When we asked a girl if she would serve at home the onion soup she'd prepared in class, she just laughed. The word food normally meant nshima, the solid maize staple known as ugali in East Africa, or sadza in Zimbabwe, or papa in South Africa. Telling the students about the multiracial Outward Bound course he attended, one of the students, Romy Luchen, reported to the other boys' amazement that he'd eaten no food for 2 weeks. The special meal which we sometimes provided on Saturdays was very popular. Edward Sakufiwa recalls, "We were served with delicious meals, at least by school standards. The meal included a good relish, meat or chicken, which was a break from the less popular relishes such as beans. Sometimes well-buttered bread and tea with lots of milk was served. On one occasion, the school was offered a whole buffalo. We thought this would be a treat, but it was rather tough, and after a week of non-stop buffalo, the students started complaining." There's now a little inset section on the University of Zambia. President Kaunda was installed as the first Chancellor of the University of Zambia in July 1966. We attended the ceremony, which took place at a temporary campus located a stone's throw of the British High Commission. This so suited the students, who were keen to throw stones at the British High Commission to protest against what they saw as British complicity with the illegal Smith regime in Rhodesia. In his address, Kaunda recalled discussions which had begun as early as 1948 about the provision of a university college in Lusaka, on the lines of those established in Ibadan in Nigeria and Makerere in Uganda. The need became more urgent when the recently elected apartheid regime in South Africa refused to admit any more Africans from Northern Rhodesia or Nyasaland to Fort Hare, where the earlier graduates had studied. In 1953, the plans were going firm, but in Kaunda's words, "Unfortunately, this great project was killed by the creation of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland 6 months later. The plan for a university college primarily for Africans became confused with a parallel proposal by Rhodesian Europeans to build their own university. The resulting University of Rhodesia and Nyasaland was built in Salisbury, now Harare, and although it was racially mixed and dubbed by most whites the Kremlin on the Hill, it was not always a place where African students felt at ease. Zambia remained, again in the President's words, economically one of the most developed countries on the continent, but educationally one of the least developed. Zambia had to wait another 13 years for its own university. An impressive campaign had been organised to make the university a popular national project. Small fundraising events were held all over the country, including Coloma, and voluntary donations came from Zambians in all walks of life, even from lepers. We went to the university again to attend the very first degree ceremony in 1969. President Nyerere of Tanzania was the guest of honour. We were proud in 1975 when we heard that the 6 students from our first intake at Coloma all received their degrees, 2 of whom, Samuel Zilombo and Shamutiba Kanyanga, going on to teach at the university itself. January 1967 saw Kaloma's school roll increase from 140 to 501, and the staff from 7 to 23. Many of the new arrivals were girls, and it was not easy for some of those who came from other parts of the country. Venus Nangamba wrote, "At first I was very unhappy. There was a tree in the school compound that I climbed into and cried because I thought I could see my parents' house from the top." Gabriella Mtonga wrote, "I remember my terrible journey to get there. I was alone on the train with a heavy suitcase. I had no idea where Coloma was, and I asked at every station if it was time to get off. I fell over several times with the suitcase on my way up from the station. At school I was given a bed in the dormitory, but I could not speak a word of Tonga, and I was so unhappy that I did not even go to the dining room for 3 weeks. Fortunately, one of the girls, Edna Ngoma, could speak Nyanja and looked after me and brought me food. After 3 weeks, I said to myself that I would just have to face up to my difficulties, and from then on, I played a full part in school life, eventually becoming a prefect. Herbert Hamuchenje wrote, "My parents were poor villagers and could only give me enough money to pay my train fare to and from school. Without the free education provided by the Transitional Development Plan, I would not have been able to go to school at all. I did not know what to expect on arrival. The newcomers were mocked. I did not mix freely and kept out of trouble. I read a lot and was a serious student, finding consolation in books as I had few other resources." A brilliant student, Herbert ended up as the chief executive of Unilever in southern Africa. Bates Namuyamba, who later held several ministerial posts in the government, recalled, "Another aspect of school life that would surprise present-day students was that everything was provided free. Transport to and from school, boarding costs and uniform." As Gabriella's story suggests, the train played an important part in life in Colombo in those days when there were few bus services. Almost every school in the country opened and closed on the same day, and the conditions on the overcrowded trains were terrible. Lamek Banda, a former student at Chizongwe, described his journey from Ndola. "About 200 were to go into 4th class. I was scared because I knew I could not enter as I had heavy baggage. All the people rushed inside. It was survival of the fittest. I was about to cry when I thought of going 3rd class. I tried to enter, but some very undisciplined railway workers refused to let me enter. I had no alternative but to enter through the window after putting my katundu, my luggage, inside the coach. At Colombo, the steam train was often hours late, but we could telephone to check when it was expected. Diesel trains came in 1967 and they were more punctual, but the daily train often arrived at night. When the term began in 1968, it came in at 11:30 in the night, and the students staggered up the half-mile from the station in the pelting rain with their tin boxes on their heads, through the puddles and the long grass, straight into the dormitories. The new teachers arriving from Britain had been impressed at first by the neat new houses where they would live, but they were rapidly confronted with the reality of faulty wiring, cockroaches, and worst of all, a shortage of water. Colombo's water supply came from a small dam owned by the railway. The dam was silted up, and what little water came from it was pumped up into a water tower and then used both by the steam trains and by the local population. The arrival of a huge boarding school put an impossible strain on this meagre supply. Taps ran dry most of the time, and we used to store the water, rather muddy-looking water, in the bath and channeled dirty bath water to irrigate our bananas. In 1967, the health inspector advised closing the school, and I advised the ministry unsuccessfully that at least the school's expansion should be put on hold until the problem was solved. The local Catholic priest was a water diviner. He swung his stick and located a good spot and raised funds to dig a new borehole, which led to some improvement. Then the town council paid a consultant to investigate the problem, who advised that a second water tower should be built when there wasn't enough water to fill the first one. Things gradually improved, perhaps due to the diesel trains taking over from the steam trains on the railway. But in 1969, the system broke down again, and one day at school assembly, I demonstrated drinking water from a barrel of water mixed with alum, to persuade the students to drink it. They refused. During our stay in Mufulira, we had attended a short course on archaeology at the National Museum, and we had taken part in excavations in Livingstone and on a site near Mkushi in the north of the country. The plateau around Colombo had been inhabited by early Iron Age people from the year 300 to 1300, and they first introduced agriculture. This period was known as that of the Colombo culture. There was evidence of earlier Stone Age people too. Edith wrote to her parents, "I took about 30 pupils down to the riverside. When I gathered the group together, I asked cheerfully, expecting the answer no, 'Has anyone found a hand axe?' There was a chorus of yes, and they'd found about 8 good specimens. This set the Archaeological Society off to a good start. A group of us climbed up the jagged Shakaunda Hill to photograph the only rock painting in southern Zambia. Then, in 1967 to 68, we undertook a proper dig at Matobo near Colombo. and we unearthed a hut floor which could be dated by radiocarbon to around 1000 CE, that's AD. Edith wrote this up for the Zambia Museum's journal. There's a little inset here saying, teacher says, prehistoric man ate uncooked food. Schoolboy says, just like Europeans. The students later enthusiastically took part in an oral history project, making contact with elderly people in their home villages. We had by this time bought a Land Rover, and we took members of the Historical Society to their home villages, where they recorded interviews with a remarkable selection of old people. The interviews were collected in a cyclo-styled, and later printed, booklet entitled Busongo Bwabapati Bufwa Amwabo. The stories of old people die with them. The memories, even if occasionally inaccurate, revealed a lot about rural life in early colonial times. Siatwinda was a well-known herbalist who claimed to be 108 years old. He had worked on the construction of the railway and remembered seeing the first car. Mukwenda had a Lozi name. The Lozi were the people from the western province, not the southern province. A Lozi name which she was given as a slave. She was taken from her mother when she was about 5 years old. And she said, translated, this was during the last days of the slave raids. The Lozi did not kill the parents. They just wanted to take the children. The people who had taken them said, stop crying. We're taking you to your mothers. When they reached Sesheke, meat was cooked and the children were given some meat. At this time, the railway was not yet built. At Sesheke, spears were used for killing animals and for dancing. They used decorated pots for storing food, holding water, and as cooking pots. They were forced to go to Sunday services. Since this was the first time they'd even seen churches, it was very strange for them. They had to pray and sing songs about God. After some time, before she had breasts, she ran away. They walked the whole day and slept in the forest where there were a lot of hyenas. They could hear them roaring angrily all night long, but they were not attacked. The next morning they started off again and came to the railway line. They were afraid because they had not crossed it when they were taken away. Siankusule was one of the first teachers from 1927 to 1946. He described Tonga life. The Tonga people wore bark of trees and skins of animals such as sheep and goats, covering only the front and back parts. Blankets were also made from skins of animals. They also knew how to trap animals by using fall traps and spring traps. They grew sweet corn and watermelons and gathered wild fruits. Tobacco was sent to the parents before marriage. Lobola, that's the dowry paid to parents of the bride, was 15 sheep and 10 beads, which were given to the parents of the girl. They usually got married at a very young age. We started a small museum at the school, which was much appreciated by Vice President Simon Kapwepwe, who was a keen promoter of Zambia's heritage when he visited Kaloma. We also took 3 members of the Historical Society to visit the Western Province. Scriven Masole remembers, at Moyo we had an audience with the Litunga, that's the king, Gambela Sikota. We also had an audience with Mulena Mukwai Makwibi, the king's sister, who talked with us and served us with tea and biscuits. The chief minister instructed us in the formal behaviour required in the Litunga's presence. We had to kneel and clap as we approached. Mrs. Watt appeared to have some difficulty in getting down far enough, and the Litunga indicated that she could remain standing. He was very pleasant and pleased to have a visit from his southern province cousins. The Tonga and Lozi people, Tonga in the southern province, Lozi in the western province, have a joking relationship where they call each other cousins. Many other clubs and societies were organised at Kaloma, with one member of staff acting as sponsor. Joshua Trillo sponsored the traditional Tonga dance club, Ngoma Yamanu, Drum of Wisdom, which was always on demand at independence celebrations and national competitions. The Science Club, known as JETS, Junior Engineers, Technicians and Scientists, won a national competition and led some students into careers in science and engineering. The Young Farmers Club raised chickens and took part in agricultural shows. The Ballroom Club was an occasion for boys and girls to mix without breaking school rules. There were scouts, guides, a debating society, a school band, a World Welfare Association, a chess club, one of the members of which, Charles Namushia, became the national champion, and a French club. Clubs blossomed and withered. Members of the Mechanics Club hoped to be able to service cars under the supervision of Brian Lundell, one of the South African teachers. He was a perfectionist, however, and got the members to construct an extremely solid inspection pit. This took so long that they never got round to servicing cars, and the empty pit still stands as Brian's monument. The student Christian movement was quite strong in Zambia, and the Colombo branch was proud to host a conference in 1967 with large numbers of students from other schools representing the variety of Protestant and evangelical churches in the country. Many of these churches were the result of American missionary activity. In the southern province, we had schools run by the Pilgrim Holiness, the Church of Christ, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the Salvation Army, as well as the Methodists, Anglicans, and Roman Catholics. As ours was a state school, the Catholics built a small convent nearby and provided us with 2 exceptionally good teachers. Some clubs promoted particular sports: football, volleyball, table tennis, badminton, hockey, and netball. We created a large sports field, but the facilities were never ideal. Nonetheless, Colombo built up a formidable reputation in athletics at provincial and national events and produced some star performers. Hilda Mwene was the first woman to win the National Women's Cross Country, and Ambrose Mianda represented Zambia in the East African Championships in 1972. There's another inset here. Overheard teacher saying, "What is Zambia's national slogan?" Boy, after much thought, "Things go better with big, big Coke." Correct answer, one Zambia, one nation. At Colombo, as at Chizongwe, we staged some good theatre. In the first year, we put on a Zambianized version of Molière, which I had written, called The Unwilling Doctor. Other plays included a Nigerian play, Obadzeng Goes to Town by Saka Akwaye, Bernard Shaw's Androcles and the Lion, Wole Soyinka's The Trials of Brother Jero, and the South African township musical King Kong, which I had first enjoyed in London. Darius Bubala remembers helping the art teacher to paint the township scenery on the back of the stage, and the painting survived there for many years. We had one major crisis during our years at Colombo, and it revealed some of the tensions inherent in co-education. I was away that day, but I got word that trouble had erupted. The deputy head had caught a boy prefect with a junior girl in the prefect's room with the windows blacked out. He sent all the girls to their dormitories, and some of the boys started plotting how to react. They began by tearing down the fence around the girls' dormitories and threatened the deputy head. Rather unwisely, he called the police. They overreacted and took 38 boys to the police station. Unrest continued overnight. Mishek Munguza described things well. "I think one of the problems had been the bar that had been put up at the tuck shop so that girls and boys had to queue up separately. It was pulled down that night before the boys began to try to destroy the fence around the girls' dormitories, and there was no weekend entertainment that Saturday." Simon Mudenda recalls, "Some of the boys ran to the Young Farmers Club and climbed into the chicken houses to sleep. They broke under the weight and the boys fell out. On the following day, the boys called for a strike and forbade anybody to eat in the dining hall. Mr. Watt effectively broke the strike by going up to each student one by one and inviting him or her to go in with him." Occasional eruptions like this were not unusual in Zambian boarding schools, but it was a profoundly depressing experience because we had such good relations with the students. Edith asked some of the women ex-students in 2003 what they thought of co-education in retrospect. They did not condemn it. They said it was true that boys bullied the girls, but the girls did learn to stand up to them. Nor did they think that girls tried not to shine in class for fear of provoking the boys, which is what some of the teachers suspected. After this riot, various sanctions were imposed on the whole school for a month or two. I decided that some of the boys who were proved to have been seriously at fault should be expelled. The provincial education officer opposed this, and I offered my resignation. In the end, I was persuaded to stay on, and I'm glad I did, as the final 2 years at Colombo were happy ones. Leaving Colombo in December 1970 was an emotional affair. The district governor spoke appreciatively of our service and the way in which we had identified with Zambian society. He said, "To me, Colombo is like a child born in the morning, walking at noon and performing all the duties in the afternoon. It has taken no time for Colombo to grow, and it is already ahead of some of the secondary schools that have been in existence for about 20 years. And this is because of your untiring efforts." Local people saw the school as a symbol of post-independence development and were happy that it was doing well. There had, of course, been tensions. The influx of a lot of new expatriates into this tiny community occasionally led to misunderstandings. and one or two of our staff exploited this. The southern province and most of our students supported the opposition ANC. Students would refuse to buy party cards when aggressively approached by members of the local UNIP youth, as the government party. They would also sing the national anthem in school assembly with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. Some local politicians wrongly believed that we encouraged such things. Relations with the Ministry of Education also had its rough moments, especially after the riot in 1968. But I left with the impression that they would have been happy if I had stayed on longer. It was in fact a hard decision to leave. We both loved Zambia, and especially Zambians. And I was offered quite a good job at the Mindolo Ecumenical Foundation in Kitwe, on the Copperbelt. But we both had elderly parents in England, and England was still home. I have been back to Coloma several times since. I found the school in bad shape in 1982, toilets out of use and the windows smashed. Things were starting to improve in 2003. There were some computers, the toilet blocks had been restored, and there were new bunk beds. In 2011, however, it was looking better still. The buildings were painted, the classrooms looked smart with more computers, and a smart school bus stood in the yard. The government was not able to be generous as it was in the early days, but support has come from parents and from the Coloma Old Students Association, which had finally been established. Prominent former students included, from our time there, ex-Minister Bates Namuyamba and India Musokotwane, who had been the regional director of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. The Environmental Resource Centre in Southern Africa has been named in his honour after his death. After our departure, Coloma educated, among others, Hakainde Hichilema, twice runner-up for the presidency, and now the president, in fact, and the governor of the bank, Dr. Dani Kalyalia. Back in England, Edith began a project collecting the stories and reflections of expatriate teachers who worked in Zambia during the immediate pre- and post-independence period. She was not aiming to write a book, but to create an archive which might be useful to future students of educational history. This material is available for researchers. We also renewed contact with Francis Makambwe, who ran the Boy Scouts at Chisongwe. He had become an Anglican priest and moved to London, where he was extremely popular as a vicar. He set up a charity fighting poverty in Zambia with the aim of supporting development in his home area, Petauka in the Eastern Province. He brought me onto his committee, and I have visited 2 villages where we have financed water projects. The charity continues after his death, mainly funding education for young people in the Northern Province. The creation of a voluntary service movement in Zambia is described in Chapter 8. Reflections on 10 years in Northern Rhodesia and Zambia. Boarding schools in Africa, based loosely on the British public school tradition, were of course a tool of colonial cultural domination, and teachers like me were part of the system, even as we supported liberation from it. All over the former empires, the policy of removing children from their culture has provoked controversy, the cases of Australia and North America being the most shocking. In Zambia, no children were forced to go to boarding schools, although sending children to school was seen as a way of creating wage earners who could pay colonial taxes. But as elsewhere, modern education created divisions in society. Sometimes these were harmless, such as when Coloma students insisting on dressing in their smart school uniforms and polished shoes when visiting their village. Members of the urban elite created by education became estranged from their relatives still living in villages. Some students suffered from psychiatric problems while trying to bridge the gap. Whatever problems it may have created, African leaders and African people wanted development, and schools and universities were the means of achieving this. They jumped on the westernizing bandwagon, farmers wanting tractors when they were not necessarily appropriate, churchmen rejecting African drums. This was all part of the very rapid change which speeded up after independence. For me, it was a fantastic privilege to experience the rapid change in Zambia over these 10 years. School syllabuses had to be made relevant. Edith and I contributed to changes in the teaching of French, history and geography. I had arrived in the country when the racial segregation typical of the British Empire, exacerbated by the presence of settlers who wanted political control, was starting to break down. The rise of nationalism meant that the African population could no longer be marginalised as before. In Northern Rhodesia, as in the Nyasaland, the political influence of the white settlers dissolved in the course of my 3 years at Fort Jameson. The new government of independent Zambia relied a lot on some of the more liberal colonial civil servants who remained, and thanks to the high price of copper, was able to recruit many foreign advisors as well as personnel vital for the ambitious development strategy of the government. The large expatriate staff at Colombo Secondary School was replicated in nearly all the government secondary schools and in many other fields, and as we saw, it could lead to tensions. But most of the teachers were excellent and did help to multiply the vitally needed number of educated and trained Zambians with impressive speed. The new state got off to a new start. The copper mining company, Anglo-American Corporation, produced a film, Zambia 64, which captures the optimism of independence. It features Ali Kankata singing an ABC of all aspects of the country: Africa, birth, copper, death, education, food, game parks, health, independence, Kaunda, Lusaka, marriage, news, overseas links, politics, relaxing, subsistence, the twist, which was all the rage, unemployment, Victoria Falls, water, youth, and Zambia. The letter J represented the agony aunt in the African males column Tell Me Josephine, who responded to all kinds of personal problems. Josephine was actually not an African woman at all, but was actually the wife of Richard Hall, Barbara Hall she was called, who in retirement produced the crossword in the London Sunday Times. Her husband, Richard Hall, had co-founded and edited the African Mail newspaper and wrote a number of books about Zambia and Africa, one of which is called The High Price of Principles. Ali Kankata introduced in the film clips including aspects of traditional culture, the Lozi Makishi dancing and Ngoni dancers, contrasted with modern life and music. Q was for the Bartholomew Bwalia Quintet and the Congolese-style band led by Baba Gaston. The first 10 years of Zambia were full of hope and progress. Money was spent, perhaps a little too freely, since everything cost more due to the sanctions against Rhodesia. The major roads to the north, the Hell Run to Tanzania, roads to Chipata and Malawi in the east and to Bulozi in the west were tarred. Hundreds of schools were built and education was free. The universities started to grow fast. Zambia Airways took off. Health provision improved. Embassies were opened. The new currency, 100 ngwe makes 1 kwacha, was launched at the rate of 2 kwachas to a British pound, and it even rose higher briefly. President Kaunda kept his nerve in the face of threats from Rhodesia and South Africa. It was good to leave Zambia when things were still going well, although the tensions we saw back at Fort Jameson between the militant grassroots of UNIP and the intellectuals and technocrats who would be the leaders of the civil service still rankled. I had experienced this at a seminar attended by President Kaunda, party members and top administrators in 1968. Valentine Musakanya, who was then head of the civil service, wrote, "The president's intention was the total politicization of the administration to ensure the party's and his own continuity in power. My motives were to ensure the eventual creation and stabilization of a national administration to serve the people impartially, so the politicians might come and go." After we left the country, the price of oil rose in 1973 and the copper price started to fall in 1975. Zambia had to face much tougher times. As Musa Kanya feared, Zambia became a one-party state in 1973. During this period, Kaunda tended to be heavy-handed and suspicious of all opponents, but he was at heart a decent and moral man. The weakening economy and the ambitions of increasingly vocal, educated people, and political changes elsewhere in Africa, led to pressure which forced Kaunda to agree to a multi-party constitution in 1991. The election of that year sent Kaunda and UNIP into the political wilderness. I was visiting Zambia just before these elections. Everyone I met, apart from one former student from the Eastern Province, which UNIP was going to win, forecast Kaunda's defeat. Sadly, his advisers had only told him what he wanted to hear, and he got quite a shock when he heard the results. Nevertheless, he handed over power gracefully to the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, and the trade union leader Frederick Chiluba became president. My friend Elias Chipimo served as chair of the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy for 5 years, and he served Chiluba as an ambassador, but I think his support waned towards the end. Under Chiluba's ultra-liberal economic policy, the country lost most of its industry and corruption prospered. I recall a slogan on a wall in Lusaka, MMD, Movement of Mandrax Dealers. His attempt to change the rules and to stand for a third term in 2002 was defeated, and he left office mired in corruption scandals. The MMD provided 2 more presidents, the popular Levi Mwanawasa who was replaced on his early death by Rupiah Banda. A second change of ruling party occurred in 2011 when Michael Sata of the Patriotic Front won. Michael Sata died in 2015, and in a close, peaceful election, his colleague Edgar Lungu became Zambia's sixth president. The atmosphere became very sour and confrontation became more ethnic than before when Lungu won again in 2016, and Hakainde Hichilema, the Colombo boy, was briefly imprisoned and continues to be harassed at the time of writing. Zambia had become something of a model democracy where governments could be voted out and political violence was very rare. I hope this tradition will not now be lost. I've been back to Zambia many times. Some of the visits are recorded below. In the villages, there's not been much change, though communications are better, thanks especially to mobile phones. The towns have grown bigger and more socially rather than racially divided. Lusaka has glossy shopping malls, while the old Main Street Cairo Road is run down. There have been traffic jams for many years, and they've got worse. Traffic on the main road north of the Copperbelt is now seriously heavy. Visiting Chipata in 2015, the town was big and bustling, a contrast from the small and sleepy Fort Jameson where I had first arrived to teach in Zambia. There are fewer internal flights than in colonial days, but most of the roads have improved since then, and many bus services, some luxury, others far from it, compete for customers. Arriving at the bus station, you find a bus which appears to be half full and promising to depart soon. In fact, many of the people sitting in the bus are not travelling, but are there to fool you. It can be a very long wait until the bus is really full and sets off. When we were at Colombo, the railway had a monopoly on the route from Zambia to Livingstone. Now even the Zambezi Express, with its comfortable coaches originally from South Africa, takes 17 hours from Livingstone to Lusaka. Understandably, most people go by bus. However, the government seems finally to be taking railways seriously. It has announced that heavy and bulk goods would be compelled to use rail, and was making a feasibility study on the rehabilitation of the main line, which runs from the Copperbelt to Zimbabwe border. A line from Malawi to Chipata opened in 2010, and a contract has been signed with the Chinese for a huge project for a 400-mile extension to link this up with the Zambia-Tanzania railway line. This is only one example of the numerous Chinese projects in Africa, which are useful for the development of infrastructure, but Zambia should be beware of allowing the Chinese to buy too much land or other assets, or this risks becoming a new colonialism.